Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Bill Roach, and this is another episode of Timeless Dialogues. And today, we are going to look at the apologist that did not have enough faith to be an atheist. Stick with me, and what we're going to do is discuss in our series here the late Dr. Norman L. Geisler. Now, before we do, I want to say today is actually a special day, and it has an incredible part to play in this story. Today is June 29th, 2023. Which is my 10-year wedding anniversary. So there we go. But what I want us to see is that in light of that, 10 years ago to the day, Dr. Geisler actually was the person who officiated my wedding. And I remember sitting there that day, listening to the wisdom that he gave with over 50 years of marriage of advice at that point. And I would love to share so much of it with you, but that was privileged information. But what we're going to do today is share some things that I want you to see about the life and ministry of Dr. Norman L. Geisler. And as many of you know, he was a mentor to me. I served as his assistant. We co-authored books together. And I want us to see the big picture of why you should read Dr. Norman Geisler. Now, this isn't going to be a long video. We could go on and on and on about it. But what I want you to see here is in a quick overview of who was this man? Where did he come from? Why was he influential? What were his different views on various key issues within evangelicalism? And then hopefully the goal is you'll go and read Dr. Norman Geisler. Now, for those of you who are unaware, we've been going through this series, looking at various things related to why you should read these key evangelical theologians and philosophers. And we've looked at people like Francis Schaeffer and R.C. Sproul and John Gerstner and Carl Henry. And today, what I want to do is continue on that same vein, but look at who is Dr. Norman Geisler. Now, in order to do so, I want to switch to this evaluation scene. And in order to sort of keep up with the fact that today is my anniversary, I went back and I found this photo. This is privileged information for you of Dr. Geisler at my wedding. Now, if you see here, obviously this is my wife and I after we have just been pronounced husband and wife. The person on the other side is my best man, Brad Davis, but the other figure there, sort of just beside my wife, is Dr. Geisler. And I remember in that message, he at that point was coming to the later portion of his ministry. He's probably officiated several weddings over the course of his life, but he gave this great call to what it means to be in a faithful biblical marriage. He also shared the gospel with great clarity. But more than anything else, he helped to commemorate literally one of the biggest days in my life and definitely in the life of my marriage. And for that, I will be forever grateful. Now, as we look at this, I want us to consider a few things. A few years ago, after the passing of Dr. Geisler, I published this book titled Defending Evangelicalism. And some of what we're going to talk about today comes from this book, and it's titled The Apologetics of Norman L. Geisler. And there I look at sort of the apologetic situation of the West, the rise of modernity and skepticism and agnosticism and atheism and all the other isms and schisms that just affect so much of the Western world. And then I discussed the influence of Dr. Geisler and why you should read his books and his key views. And today what I would do is summarize some of that book. But if you please stick with me today, we've got some special things. I want you to hear things about how did Dr. Geisler meet his wife? How was he called into ministry? What did it look like for this figure who was in many respects unqualified for the cause of ministry to serve in ministry? Now, there is actually something that's probably better than what I'm going to do today that achieved that same end. Namely, there's a documentary titled Unqualified. It was in many respects edited and put together by his son, Dr. David Geisler. And if you go and you look up the movie Norman Geisler, Unqualified, there you're going to see a whole host of figures coming together to talk about the key issues that Dr. Geisler fought for and defended within his whole career and ministry. But also you're going to see the big picture of the man's life. And I would highly encourage you to go find the website, click the links, try to host the film at your church, go through a study curriculum that they have that follows these key battles, and even purchase the movie. Keep it around. You know, sometimes we go through a curriculum one year and 2 or 3 years later, we want to watch the movie again. So go take your church through the curriculum, but also buy the movie so you can have it and use it to serve your family and your church in years to come. Because one thing I will say about this, Dr. Geisler has a great testimony that you can see how God took this figure who really was unqualified, virtually illiterate, to become one of the most influential philosopher apologists of our day. Now, what I want to do here is I want to switch to this article by Christianity Today. And if you look at it here, it says this: died apologist Dr. Norman Geisler, who didn't have enough faith to be an atheist. Now, for all of you who know Dr. Geisler, you realize very quickly that was a play on words from one of his published books titled I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with Dr. Frank Turek. And what this looks at was on July 1st, 2019, Dr. Geisler passed away. And notice what this article goes on to say. Just 2 months after his retirement from public ministry, evangelical theologian Norman Geisler died Monday at age 86. He had been hospitalized for over the weekend after suffering a blood clot in his brain. Now, what you have to see here is that Dr. Geisler, I think the most influential thing on this is just 2 months after his retirement, Dr. Geisler worked for the sake of the gospel virtually up to the very end. And that's so inspiring because a lot of people you will find work very hard in the beginning of their ministry and maybe in the middle of their ministry, but very few will continue to the very end. Dr. Geisler not only fought to the end, but he fought well. He finished well in his ministry. And like all of us, we know that death is something that is in many respects knocking at our door. You know, Dr. Geisler suffered an unfortunate health event, and to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. He died in Christ, and God used the life of Dr. Geisler in so many ways, and the founding of schools and the raising up of many Christian leaders. And I just remember being at his funeral, seeing these key people that he poured his life into and hearing one of the best funeral messages of my entire life. Now, what I want to do here is go through a few brief comments here from this article and discuss them, and then we'll transition to looking a little bit more at the life of Dr. Geisler. So, described as a cross between Thomas Aquinas and Billy Graham, Geisler was a prolific author, apologist, and professor, as well as co-founder and former president of Southern Evangelical Seminary, and which was in Charlotte, North Carolina. Now, it goes on to say this: many evangelical leaders consider Geisler among the top Christian thinkers in recent decades, with Pastor Derwin Gray calling him one of Christianity's greatest philosophers, apologists, and theologians. Now, at the Colson Center, John Stone Street went on to say this, that Geisler was a towering figure in Christian apologetics and philosophy. In fact, he was recognized and heralded as the 20th century's greatest philosopher apologist in that sense. Now, there were other people that had bigger, sort of just pure philosophical venues. I'm thinking like Alvin Plantinga. But Dr. Geisler was a man that was able to reach the local church and the evangelical seminary and the academy in ways that those other figures were not able to. Now, as we see the article here, it gives us a little bit of a highlight of what that means. It goes on to say Geisler was respected for the breadth and depth of his career of over 70 years and his model of defending the faith and the Bible through classical apologetics. So the key thing that I want you to see here is that depth and breadth. Geisler was very influential in that he realized that if you speak over a person's head, you're not really communicating to them, that you needed to be able to reach the academic where he or she is at, but the vast majority of people in this world are not at that top tier. They're at some middle or lower tier. And he used to say you need to be able to put the cookies on the bottom shelf. And that's one thing that Geisler recognizes, that if you look at the life of Dr. Geisler, he started out at the bottom shelf. And by God's grace, he worked up to the top shelf. And I think that was something that he realized, is that in order to reach people just like him, people that were just like in his position, he had to write and speak and publish in such a way that reached all the different types of people. And the reason that's important is that as we realize, we don't get to pick our audience. And if we're not faithful to speaking to the audience that's actually in front of us, we're not being faithful in our presentation to present Christ clearly. Because if we're always speaking over everybody's head and they're going, oh, wow, that was just so wonderful, I didn't understand a word of what you said, I don't know if we're being faithful to the situation that we're in. Now, if it's a mixed group of people and there's all different kinds, that's a different thing. But Geisler realized that he needed to publish and speak in a way that reached all the different kinds of people. And I think that's something that modern day apologists need to consider, is that we need to reach people where they're at for the sake of the gospel in ways and terms that they understand for the glory of God and the building up of his local church. Now, the article goes on to say this, quoting Gregory Geisler, says, when Geisler began, there were few philosophers who embraced the evangelicalism. Even more rare was a trained philosopher who was committed to helping ordinary believers and the defense of the gospel. Geisler paved the way here, and Geisler talks about this in so many respects, to allow an evangelical to have a place at defending the Christian faith. Now, one thing you notice, I didn't say a place at the table. Geisler wasn't always accepted at the table of the secular elites. He went into the secular elites and debated them at their table. He didn't just accommodate under their table, but he also was able to speak with ordinary believers. It goes on to say this, Geisler paved the way for the kind of sophisticated apologetics we enjoy today by combining scholarly rigor with a desire to equip the church and writing books that could be read and used by believers in all walks of life. Think about this. Geisler paved the way for the kind of sophisticated apologetic that we have today. In fact, one could look back at all of the key apologists that sort of came up in light of Dr. Geisler, and we can name like Bill Craig or Wynne Cordwin and several other figures who were mentored and trained by Dr. Geisler. And in fact, at one point in time, all of the key major philosopher apologists within evangelicalism found their way in connection with Dr. Geisler, either at Trinity or Dallas or Liberty or Southern Evangelical Seminary. In fact, I would consider myself a figure who was shaped and molded by Dr. Geisler in that regard. Now, the article goes on to say this. It goes on to say that when you look at Dr. Geisler, Richard Land says for Geisler, his latest defense of the faith was like drinking from a cold water in the midst of what was too often an arid and sterile theological land. And Richard Land was also known for saying something under the effect that Dr. Geisler was a good cross between Billy Graham and Thomas Aquinas. Now, we realize Thomas Aquinas was the classical apologist, the rigorous, reasoned approach to defending the historic Christian faith in that regard. Arguments for the existence of God, arguments for realism and the concept of truth and the historicity of the Bible and the inerrancy of the Bible and the claims of Jesus Christ. But Billy Graham? What do those two things have in common? Well, we realize that in many respects, evangelicalism was marked by the life and ministry of Billy Graham, this evangelistic zeal and this high authority for the Bible to reach the lost for the sake of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And Geisler was that. Geisler was this hybrid synthesis of a figure that had the highest theological training and rigorous mind with that absolute desire to defend the authority of the Bible and the authority of the Bible alone in that regard, but also with the pastor's heart and the evangelist's zeal, or we could even say the evangelist's heart and the pastor's zeal. Geisler was a pastor, apologist, evangelist, theologian, brought all together for the sake of the glory of God and in Christ. Now, it goes on to talk about his role with the Chicago Statement on biblical inerrancy, and we'll talk about that later. But I want us to look here by one more quote here by J.P. Moreland. J.P. Moreland says this, Norman Geisler was one of the 4 to 5 most influential people in my life. It was meeting Norm and reading his works that first drew my interest to philosophy, and the rest is history. He goes on to say, he was a tireless worker for the kingdom and a brother who was faithful to the end. We lost a giant, and the world is worse off for his departure. Earth's loss, heaven's reward. Now, what I want you to see here is that J.P. Moreland, in so many respects, was like many people, myself included, where he talks about how Geisler was such an influential figure, and that by meeting him, it sort of changed the rest of our lives. And I remember that I was serving in a church in Chicago, Illinois, in Cabrini Green, which was one of the worst projects in the history of the United States of America. And I remember that people were coming up to me, and there were questions that I just couldn't answer. I didn't know one, what they were sometimes actually raising as the objection. Like, what are you actually talking about? And two, if I could grasp what they were talking about, I didn't necessarily know how to answer their objections. And I remember going up Chicago Avenue one night, sort of distraught. It was a Friday night. It was hot as could be. And I popped into Moody Bible Institute, and they either had the Case for Christ or the Case for Faith, whichever one he actually participated in. And I read the whole book, and there was this chapter in there by Norman Geisler, and I saw that he was president of this school in Charlotte, North Carolina. I knew nothing about North Carolina. I knew nothing about the South or any of that. I was a Midwestern boy through and through. But I noticed that they had a school where you could learn philosophy and apologetics. Now, I was a Bible college student, and I went back to school. And while there, one of my professors was a D-Min student at SES. His name was Herb Flinkman. And through a variety of circumstances, Herb gave the contact information of a few of us to Dr. Geisler. And fast forward, I get this phone call from Dr. Geisler, and I thought it was a prank phone call. It says, "Hello, this is Norm Geisler." And I thought, whatever. There's no way this is Dr. Geisler. It's not possible. Like, how did he get my contact information? Thanks, Herb. That's really how it came. But Geisler used to do recruitment, and Geisler used to reach out to the students, and he invited me to his house. And I remember flying out there thinking, oh, I'm getting the red carpet treatment. He gave that to all the students that were trying to come out there. And he would bring people into his home, and he used it as a means of trying to encourage people to come to Southern Evangelical Seminary. Well, fast forward, I transferred out to the institution, was the first graduate of their Bible college. I finished my undergraduate there, graduated summa cum laude. And upon graduating, he asked me to be his graduate assistant. Now, in God's providence, that was used as a means of my life to teach me many things that I didn't learn. And in this article, I was actually quoted by Christianity Today, and I want to read it. And it says, William Roach, president of the International Society of Christian Apologetics, which Geisler founded in 2007, was mentored by Geisler. And I go on to say this. It says, both of us were raised in non-Christian homes. Our mothers wouldn't allow us to play football as kids. We both had alcoholic parents, struggled significantly in school, and most importantly, after our conversion to Christ, we both had to face objections to the Christian faith. I go on to say Dr. Geisler used to say he got into apologetics because he was stumped by a drunk on the streets of Detroit who claimed to be a graduate of Moody Institute. Dr. Geisler knew that he either had to find answers to people's objections or he must stop sharing his faith. Since the latter is not an option, Dr. Geisler dedicated his life to defending the historic Christian faith. And Geisler and I used to talk regularly about how similar our backgrounds were. I mean, the home life to not being able to play football to all these different things. And in many respects, I was so far behind in my academics that to be where I am today, 2 master's degrees, an undergraduate, a PhD, published 10 books, co-authored or authored, multiple articles, and all these things. I don't say that to praise myself, but it's because God did in my life what he did in Dr. Geisler's life. But as I was telling my wife recently, you know, there are times in our lives where we look back and we think, man, I should have gone to that other school, or, oh, I should have just done things differently. Now, obviously, in the providence of God, there are no shoulda, coulda, wouldas. They're all the perfect, purposeful planning of a providential God in our lives. And I told her that if it weren't for Norman Geisler, this person who knew what it was like to kind of be a step behind everybody else and how to overcome that, I wouldn't be where I'm at today. Dr. Geisler was this figure who saw in me somebody who needed extra help. So Geisler taught me how to write. He taught me how to travel and speak and do these different conferences and engage with all of these different types of people because I didn't have that. And it wasn't just Dr. Geisler. There were other figures that were there along the way. I mean, people early on in my conversion and people that discipled me and helped sense this call to ministry. But at that particular point and in that particular way, God used Norman Geisler. And for so many people, that is what was so inspiring about Dr. Geisler, his call to ministry and the way that God used him. This unqualified individual was qualified for the sake of the gospel by the glory of Christ and in the power of the cross. Now, what I want to do is I want to make a quick transition here. And I want us to see this book that I put together about Dr. Geisler. And what I want you to see here is, sorry, let me pull it up here. bear with me here. It's not moving with me the way I want it to. There we go. Sorry about that, guys. Is that I give this little segment here about the life of Dr. Geisler, and I give this quote here that says, when God wants to drill a man and thrill a man and skill a man, when God wants to mold a man to play the noblest part, when he yearns with all his heart to create so great and bold a man that all the world shall be amazed, watch his methods, watch his ways. And I go on to say this, the life and ministry of Dr. Geisler capture the sentiment of this poet's writing well. When God set out to mold the man of Norman Geisler, when he yearned with all his heart to create so great and bold a man that all the world shall be amazed, watch his methods, watch his ways. For all of those who knew Dr. Geisler personally, they will tell you he was a very bold man for Christ. He was unwilling to back down from any formidable opponent who revolted against the knowledge of Christ. Geisler was wholeheartedly committed to defending evangelicalism in an age that voiced strong opposition to evangelical convictions. Now, what I want to do here is I want us to just see a little bit of the background of Dr. Geisler. And I want to just tell one little story here that he used to tell, because I think many of us know where he went to school and all the books and some of the various organizations that he served with. But here's something that's interesting. How did this man actually come to faith in Christ? And here's what I want you to see. I said, however, to understand the impact of Norman Geisler, one must recognize the tremendous obstacles he had to overcome in life. Dr. Geisler was born in a working-class family in Warren, Michigan on July 21st, 1932. Many of Geisler's readers are unaware of the fact that he did not come from a Christian family, nor was he raised in an educated family. At the age of 9, Norm was invited by a little boy down the street to attend Vacation Bible School. After VBS was over, Mr. Costi, or Mr. Keel, and his family faithfully picked Geisler up every Sunday to go to church. At the age of 17, as a senior in high school, Norman Geisler came home one Sunday and knelt by his bed and accepted Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior. So just think about this. Think about that, how long it was from the age of 9 to 17. People that work in these ministries don't always realize the impact that they're having. I mean, it was a very, very mundane, simple thing. You're picking a guy up on a bus, and Geisler used to talk about this story and joke about how he was saved because of a local bus ministry. In the grand scheme of things, in God's providence, those bus drivers were used to help launch the ministry of one of America's greatest Christian theologians and apologists. So if you're out there and you're listening to this and you wonder, is my Sunday school teaching having any impact, or driving a bus, or picking somebody up in your car, or whatever it is that you do that may seem mundane? Well, it made a difference in the life of Norman Geisler, and you just never know what God might do. Now, it goes on here, as I say here, during his senior year of high school, someone brought up the idea of Dr. Geisler going to college. Quote, "It never even crossed my mind to go to college," end quote, Geisler would say on numerous occasions. As was said, Geisler was born into a working-class family where no one in his family and most people from his community did not attend college. In addition, Geisler had to overcome one of the more significant obstacles before he entered college. Namely, by his own admission, Geisler graduated high school virtually illiterate. The man wasn't virtually able to read. When asked, "How did you get through high school without knowing how to read?" he would reply, "I just listened to the lectures and somehow figured out how to pass the tests." Not only was Geisler virtually illiterate, but as it talks about here, he had this incident once where a teacher asked him, "How did the tale of two cities end?" And Geisler replied, "With a period." And as funny as his answer may have been, Geisler told us that that answer granted him a one-way ticket to the principal's office. The point being, Geisler was completely unqualified by all worldly standards to attend college. This is a significant point that marks Norman Geisler's life. It is a testimony to God's grace, who took this man from being a sort of snarky, illiterate high school kid to one of the most prolific authors in the evangelical world. Now, what I want to do here is that Geisler has told us this story numerous times, and we have seen it. But I also want us to see how that merged together. And this is something that none of you have probably ever seen. This was a video that was shot on a private phone, and I've been told by Norm that I could share it whenever I wanted back in the day. because it tells his testimony very well. So what I want to do here is I want to pull this up. Bear with me as I switch screens here. Had trouble with this earlier, had to refilm the thing. But what I want you to see is in the man's own words, you'll see a little bit of the wit and wisdom of Dr. Geisler. There we go. We all don't need to see Jocko over there on the other side. There we go. Sorry about that. These programs, sometimes they don't give you the ability to have them preset like that when you have different things that come up. So here's what I wanted to do. I want to let him speak for himself.
And you're known for all of those things, but how has your wife helped you throughout the ages to become the apologist that you are?
Pause right there. Dr. Geisler, we actually asked him how he met his wife, and this is a key influential story. It's actually testimony of God's providence, but then you see how God used his wife and this calling in his life to achieve great things.
Well, I don't believe in special revelation, but I'll tell you a story, two stories. One's funny on her end and one's more serious on my end, but we knew each other. We went to grade school together, but we didn't know each other. Our churches were a mile apart. We were north of Detroit in Warren, Michigan, and our churches were in the same, baseball leagues and the Youth for Christ and Singspirations and all of that. So I met her in jail. She was playing the organ I was witnessing because her church went to the same jail service as ours. But we really got more acquainted, through other activities. And before she went away to school, she went to Fort Wayne Bible College. I stayed in Detroit. We had an acquaintance, but it wasn't really anything serious. And then when she got to campus, she, got interested in the tall, dark, and handsome guy on campus and forgot the short, ugly guy back home. And so she was struggling about her junior year of, which direction should I go, with this guy or with the guy back home? And she went to chapel, and the president was preaching on the will of God. And that's what she needed for her life. And the president got up and he said, everybody needs God's norm for their life. So, meanwhile, true story. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, I'm going with another girl. She's going with a guy named Joe, by the way, who turned out to be a hippie and overthrew the faith. So I always rub it in. And I'm back home. I'm back home, and I'm going with a girl, a nice girl, but not really the one who would make a good life partner for me. And I'm the director of the Youth for Christ area, and I'm invited to speak at my wife's home church. She's away at school, and have a week of meetings. I did, and there's some people saved, and the pastor, God laid on the pastor's heart to call me up on the phone and say this to me: if Gabriel had come in the bedroom, shining, glowing one night, it wouldn't have been any greater. And here's what the pastor said to me on the phone. Norm, God has given you a gift. The devil wants to close your mouth, and the best way to close your mouth is to get you married to somebody who won't live what you preach. That was like, as I say, I've never gotten a direct revelation from God, but that was close. That was a direct illumination from God. And I dropped the other girl and started getting serious with her, and God was right. We've been married 55 years this June, and you want to make sure you get a life partner who is compatible, who is supportive. I would never, don't forget, when I was first saved, I couldn't read. It took me 4 years of Bible school, almost 5 years of Bible school, to catch up on all my goofing off for all the years in school. I couldn't read. I was taking the Greek third year, and the Greek teacher found out we couldn't read English. We didn't know English, so he had to teach us English before he could teach us Greek. So it took me 5 years to catch up. If God hadn't worked patiently and graciously, as I often say, I am what I am by the grace of God and the grace of my dear wife. If I didn't have grace of God in my life and didn't have a wife like her, I wouldn't have been able to do anything. I mean, she would retype my papers, which were like, I did punctuation like a pepper shaker. We need some commas here somewhere, or some colons, something like that. So my grades were at least a grade better after she got through with the papers, until I could learn how to do it myself. She has been a terrific wife, truly helped me, and supportive, never a drag, always supportive, and I thank God for His grace and for her.
Of which we say amen. And for anybody who's been around Dr. Geisler and been around his wife, she was truly just a saint of God in so many respects, that God has used not only to help many of us, but to fundamentally be that true helpmate that God has called the wife to be to her husband. Now, what I want to do here is pull up a little bit more and just look at a bit about the life and ministry of Dr. Geisler. And then we will finish by talking about a few topics. And then I'm going to give you one more special video by Dr. Geisler that some of you have seen, but some of you have not seen. So big picture, Dr. Geisler went to school for quite a long time. I mean, virtually 20 years. He started out at Emmaus Bible College, went to William Tyndale College, University of Detroit, but didn't actually finish until 1958 at Wheaton College, where he got his bachelor's in philosophy. A few years later, he got a master's in theology at Wheaton Graduate School. He went on to William Tyndale College, got a bachelor's of theology, which was like the equivalent of an MDiv at that time, from William Tyndale College in 1964. But then he went on to study philosophy at Wayne State University, the University of Detroit, Northwestern University, and eventually finished a PhD in philosophy from Loyola University. It was a Jesuit institution, and that's where he really was there. And in his graduate school time, he was known as this Thomistic philosopher, following Thomas Aquinas. And it was at Loyola, he actually used to talk about how he was more Thomistic than many of the Roman Catholics, because all of them at that time were just being heavily influenced by really just existentialism and all of the subjectivity and the radical concepts in being that they were bringing forth. Now, his professional career had a variety of pastoral positions, but academically, he was a part-time instructor at Detroit Bible College. He was a graduate assistant at Wheaton College. He was a full-time assistant professor at Detroit Bible College, and then he became an assistant professor of philosophy at Trinity College, visiting professor of philosophy at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and then he became the chair of philosophy of religion at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And it was really during that time that Dr. Geisler was equipping many of the key influential figures. We're thinking of Ravi Zacharias, of William Lane Craig, Wynne Cordwin, David Beck, and all of the rest. Now, from there, he went on to be professor at Dallas Seminary of Systematic Theology, but he also ended up going to Liberty University and co-founding Southern Evangelical Seminary. But there's a few other things that were going on during this time. We'll discuss these in just a second, but he was the one of the general editors and director of publications for the International Council on Biblical Inerrancy. He was part of the drafting committee of the International Council on Biblical Inerrancy, co-founded Southern Evangelical Seminary, dean of Southern Evangelical Seminary, president of Southern Evangelical Seminary. He also went on to co-found Veritas Evangelical Seminary, which is now Veritas International University. And just by way of caveat, I see it as just a great privilege that I serve as the dean of the Norman L. Geisler Chair of Christian Apologetics at Veritas, and I also oversee their D-Min and Apologetics program. He also was the president of the Evangelical Theological Society. He was the co-founder of the International Society of Christian Apologetics and its first president. He was the co-founder of the Evangelical Philosophical Society and its first president. The point that I want you to see here is that Dr. Geisler was a man that was so influential in a variety of different areas. He served as the advisor to many of the most influential apologists. He served at some of the most influential seminaries during his time. He was also a key figure in the academic societies of evangelical theology, evangelical philosophy, and evangelical apologetics. But what I also want you to see, and we can just look at a few of these, Geisler also had a very strong influence within the local church. And I don't just think, I know, it was because He was saved out of a small church, and God used that to change his life, and Geisler never lost his vision for the local church. And that's something that I think a lot of apologists need to learn today. So many of them think they need to go directly towards the academy, but Geisler had a good way of balancing it by serving the local church. And, he was the director of the Northeast Suburban Youth for Christ near Detroit. He was pastor of Dayton Center Church, where he was ordained in 1956, assistant pastor of River Grove Church in River Grove, Illinois, pastor of Memorial Baptist Church in Warren, Michigan, and, president of the alumni at Detroit Bible College. He was a senior pastor of Southern Evangelical Church, and it traveled and spoke at churches all over the country. Has multiple honors and recognitions from various different publications and from various different groups talking about the influence. There were many books put out for him. Probably one of the main festschrifts that we have for him is I Am Put Here for the Defense of the Gospel, that was edited in his name, but also the documentary Unqualified that was projected and it came out just a couple years ago. Now, one other thing before we look at this, Dr. Geisler's, you can see all these different publications. It would take too long to go through. Here's the number everybody wants to look at, the main thing. Can't even scroll fast enough, can we? Give or take, Geisler published about 128 books. Think about that, from a man that was virtually illiterate to publishing 128 plus books. And there are still a few things that were not in publication that they're editing to put into publication. And like I said, this book here, Defending Inerrancy, discusses so many of those things. Now, I want us to briefly talk about a few of these. We could talk about Geisler's defense of classical realism or classical apologetics, but I want us to talk briefly about just this classic doctrine of inerrancy, just for a couple of minutes. Dr. Geisler was on really the founding committee for the International Society of Christian Apologetics, and I co-authored a book with Geisler titled Defending Inerrancy. J.I. Packer wrote the foreword to it, and there we trace this battle for the Bible with evangelicalism. And what was going on is that prior to that, liberalism and anti-supernaturalism and skepticism and agnosticism and all the other isms and schisms were starting to give us the battle of modernity against evangelical belief, against orthodoxy in that regard. And we lay out a whole host of these things as it was permeating in the founding of Westminster and as it started to hit academia. But what was going on is that there was a large movement of people denying, questioning, disregarding the relevance of the inerrancy of the Bible. The inerrancy is the total truthfulness of the Bible. The Bible is without error. And prior to this, you had what was known as the Ligonier Conference on Biblical Inerrancy, and you had figures such as John Geisler and Sproul and John Frame and Bonson and several figures within that put out what was known as the Ligonier Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. And Sproul and others knew that this couldn't just be like a small Presbyterian thing, because the issue of the battle for the Bible was something that was plaguing more than just Presbyterian circles. It was plaguing the entire evangelical world in that regard. So what they did is they recruited figures such as Francis Schaeffer and Norman Geisler and Walt Kaiser and Geisler and several other figures, and they had what was known as the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy and the Chicago Summit on Inerrancy, where they put together a whole series of affirmations and denials, explain exactly what do we mean by inerrancy and what do we not mean by inerrancy. And Geisler was one of the founders of that, one of the chief signers of it, and he was the man that oversaw the major publications. He was the general editor in all regards of the publications during that 10-year time period. But Geisler was also very formidable in the defense of the inerrancy of the Bible. He defended the truthfulness of the inerrancy and the resurrection of the Bible against detractors, even at places like Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He defended the historicity of the resurrection accounts and the Genesis accounts versus figures at Dallas Seminary and other figures within evangelicalism. Geisler stood up against figures like Bob Gundry, who was saying that the Gospels were just Jewish midrash and that they were just sort of this historical genre that was really non-historical in so many regards. It's this non-historical narrative genre, so it may look like history, but we know from the genre criticism that it's not actually history, so they would say. Now, there's a lot of things that could go into that discussion, and Geisler was a figure that we tried to summarize in this chapter titled Defending the Classic Doctrine of Inerrancy. So if you want to see more of that, please go and read the chapter in my book. If you want to see more on the topic in general, go read the book Defending Inerrancy. So Defending Evangelicalism, we'll give you the one on Geisler and his important impact, but Defending Inerrancy will explain that battle much, much more. Now, in addition to it, Geisler was also influential in that he defended the classical understanding of apologetics, not only just the two-step apologetics, where you have God, that you defend the existence and attributes of God, but also the historicity and the inerrancy of the Bible. But in many respects, Geisler had like a three-step apologetic: defend the reality of truth, God, then the Bible. Because what was going on is it actually used to be like the 10 points to prove Christian apologetics, but when people were denying the concept of truth so much, he knew that he had to add a couple more on there in order to solidify that in a pure apologetic. But Geisler was also key in trying to defend this notion that God's attributes are what were known as the classical attributes: the eternality of God, the infinity of God, the simplicity of God, the notion that God is impassible, that he has no parts nor passions in that regard. And that's what became not only classical apologetics, but the classical theism that came forth through Thomas Aquinas. And some people today are like, oh, this is just Thomas Aquinas. No, that's classical theism. There's all these figures saying, oh, this idea of simplicity, that's just that Thomistic idea. It's just incorrect. I mean, you can find it, and Geisler spent ample time showing this was the classic view coming from the early church into figures like Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, brought in by Calvin, the scholastics. I mean, it is the classic doctrine of God in this regard. And Geisler was unique against figures such as Clark Pinnock, who was denying the exhaustive foreknowledge and the classical attributes of God. That was more of like the extreme denial, but also you had other denials by guys like William Lane Craig, who don't affirm classical theism. He's a theistic personalist. And we explained so much of that and so much more. Now, here's how I kind of want to finish this, is I want to bring this up, and I want us to look at one more video that we have of Dr. Geisler talking about the influence of Thomism. And I'm just making sure I got all my bells and whistles right here. And what he does is he talks about the role of Thomas Aquinas and his thought and the role that it has on evangelicalism here. So with no further ado, let's listen in here.
Yeah, where would evangelicalism be today without Aquinas? Knowingly or unknowingly, it would be in deep, deep trouble without Aquinas, because all it is of value, all it is enduring, all it is really preserving orthodoxy is due to classical theology and classical apologetics. And to the degree that we've dissipated and gotten away from that, we've gotten away from the things that Aquinas taught. Unfortunately, most of evangelicalism has gotten away from it. So, but what is good and what is enduring is due to Aquinas, whether they know it or not, whether they even heard his name or not, whether they are singing "Should Old Aquinas Be Forgotten," never brought to mind or not, because what are the things that are hindering us? Denial of classical attributes of God, denial of classical theology is behind most of the main intellectual drifts from true evangelicalism today. Whether it's on hermeneutics, those things I listed at the beginning, his hermeneutical view, his view of analogy, his view of scripture, his view of inerrancy, his view of God, classical attributes of God. It's forsaking those things that have gotten us in trouble. So it's back to Aquinas, whether you want his name. Sproul used to tell me this. R.C. Sproul and I spent 10 years together working on the Inerrancy Conference, and so we became rather close, even though I'm not a 5-point Calvinist, I'm a moderate Calvinist, and he is. We hold the same classical theology, and Sproul said, wherever I go, I give him what Aquinas said in his Reformed circles. He said, I just don't tell him I got it from Aquinas. Because that would put an unnecessary wall there. So I do that too. If I can find a quote from Augustine saying the same thing, just use Augustine, because they don't have that visceral reaction to Augustine that they have to Aquinas. But we're overcoming that to some degree. So.
And what you see there is just the cover of the book Thomas Aquinas that Geisler put out. So let's finish with this. Dr. Geisler used to tell me this: there are two fears in life, fear of God and fear of man. And never let your fear of man trump your fear of God. So why should you read Norman Geisler? One, Norman Geisler was a man that God used to shape so many of the pastor, theologian, apologists that we have today. In many respects, he's the indispensable apologist of our day. Without Norman Geisler, we would not have so many of the things that make evangelicalism evangelical. He knew how to defend the historic Christian faith in our day and age. Another thing about Dr. Geisler is that he understood our age. He understood the situation that we find ourselves in because he was a student of philosophy and of the world in which we live. And the takeaway from that is that in order to understand the people that are in front of us, we need to understand what the people in front of us are thinking and how they're engaging these different topics. We need to understand where to actually put our finger down on a topic in order to rightly address the issue. So we could say so many more things about Dr. Geisler, but I say this: pick up the writings of Dr. Geisler, listen to the lectures of Dr. Geisler, but first and foremost, follow the Christ that Norman Geisler preached for so many years. If you find this video helpful, send it to somebody. Maybe it will encourage them in the way that Mr. Costi and the others that all those years ago were faithful in picking up Norm. Send it to somebody else. There may be somebody else that can be inspired by the life of Norman Geisler, and they too will do great things for the cause of Christ.